Section 9 of Youth by Leo Tolstoy, translated by C.J. Hogarth. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 33 through 36. Chapter 33. Our Neighbors. On the first day after our arrival, I had been greatly astonished that Papa should speak of our neighbors, the Epifanovs, as nice people, and still more so that he should go to call upon them. The fact was that we had long been at law over some land with this family. When a child, I had more than once heard Papa raging over the litigation, abusing the Epifanovs, and warning people, so I understood him, against them. Likewise, I had heard Yakov speak of them as our enemies, and black people, and could remember Mamma requesting that their names should never be mentioned in her presence, nor indeed in the house at all. From these data I, as a child, had arrived at the clear and assured conviction that the Epifanovs were foemen of ours who would at any time stab or strangle both Papa and his sons if they should ever come across them, as well as that they were black people in the literal sense of the term. Consequently, when in the year that Mamma died I chanced to catch sight of Avdotia, la belle Flamande, on the occasion of a visit which she paid to my mother, I found it hard to believe that she did not come of a family of negroes. All the same, I had the lowest possible opinion of the family, and, for all that we saw much of them that summer, continued to be strongly prejudiced against them. As a matter of fact, their household only consisted of the mother, a widow of 50, but a very well-preserved, cheery old woman, a beautiful daughter named Avdotia, and a son, Peter, who was a stammerer, unmarried, and of very serious disposition. For the last 20 years before her husband's death, Madame Epifanov had lived apart from him, sometimes in St. Petersburg, where she had relatives, but more frequently at her village of Mitishchi, which stood some 3 versts from ours. Yet the neighborhood had taken to circulating such horrible tales concerning her mode of life that Messalina was, by comparison, a blameless child, which was why my mother had requested her name never to be mentioned. As a matter of fact, not 1/10 part of the most cruel of all gossip, the gossip of country houses, is worthy of credence, and although when I first made Madame's acquaintance she had living with her in the house a clerk named Mitusha, who had been promoted from a serf, and who, curled, pomaded, and dressed in a frock-coat of Circassian pattern, always stood behind his mistress's chair at luncheon, while from time to time she invited her guests to admire his handsome eyes and mouth, there was nothing for gossip to take hold of. I believe, too, that since the time, 10 years earlier, when she had recalled her dutiful son Peter from the service, she had wholly changed her mode of living. It seems her property had never been a large one, merely 100 souls or so (this refers, of course, to the days of serfdom), and that during her previous life of gaiety she had spent a great deal. Consequently, when some 10 years ago those portions of the property which had been mortgaged and remortgaged had been foreclosed upon and compulsorily sold by auction, she had come to the conclusion that all these unpleasant details of distress upon valuation of her property had been due not so much to failure to pay the interest as to the fact that she was a woman. Wherefore she had written to her son, then serving with his regiment, to come and save his mother from her embarrassments, and he, like a dutiful son, conceiving that his first duty was to comfort his mother in her old age, had straightway resigned his commission. For all that, he had been doing well in his profession and was hoping soon to become independent, and had come to join her in the country. Despite his plain face, uncouth demeanour, and fault of stuttering, Peter was a man of unswerving principles, and of the most extraordinary good sense. Somehow, by small borrowings, sundry strokes of business, petitions for grace, and promises to repay, he contrived to carry on the property, and, making himself overseer, donned his father's greatcoat, still preserved in a drawer, dispensed with horses and carriages, discouraged guests from calling at Mitishchi, fashioned his own sleighs, increased his arable land and curtailed that of the serfs, felled his own timber, sold his produce in person, and saw to matters generally. Indeed, he swore, and kept his oath, that, until all outstanding debts were paid, he would never wear any clothes than his father's greatcoat and a corduroy jacket which he had made for himself, nor yet ride in aught but a country wagon, drawn by peasants' horses. This stoical mode of life he sought to apply also to his family, so far as the sympathetic respect which he conceived to be his mother's due would allow of, so that, although in the drawing-room he would show her only stuttering servility, and fulfill all her wishes, and blame any one who did not do precisely as she bid them, in his study or his office he would overhaul the cook if she had served up so much as a duck without his orders, or any one responsible for sending a serf, even though at Madame's own bidding, to inquire after a neighbor's health, or for dispatching the peasant girls into the wood to gather wild raspberries, instead of setting them to weed the kitchen garden. Within 4 years every debt had been repaid, and Peter had gone to Moscow and returned thence in a new jacket and tarantass, a two-wheeled carriage. Yet, despite this flourishing position of affairs, he still preserved the stoical tendencies in which, to tell the truth, he took a certain vague pride before his family and strangers, since he would frequently say with a stutter, "Any one who really wishes to see me will be glad to see me even in my dressing-gown, and to eat nothing but shtchi (cabbage soup) and kasha (buckwheat gruel) at my table. That is what I eat myself," he would add. In his every word and movement spoke pride based upon a consciousness of having sacrificed himself for his mother and redeemed the property, as well as contempt for any one who had not done something of the same kind. The mother and daughter were altogether different characters from Peter, as well as altogether different from one another. The former was one of the most agreeable, uniformly good-tempered, and cheerful women whom one could possibly meet. Anything attractive and genuinely happy delighted her. Even the faculty of being pleased with the sight of young people enjoying themselves (it is only in the best-natured of elderly folk that one meets with that trait) she possessed to the full. On the other hand, her daughter was of a grave turn of mind. Rather, she was of that peculiarly careless, absent-minded, gratuitously distant bearing which commonly distinguishes unmarried beauties. Whenever she tried to be gay, her gaiety somehow seemed to be unnatural to her, so that she always appeared to be laughing either at herself or at the persons to whom she was speaking, or at the world in general, a thing which possibly she had no real intention of doing. Often I asked myself in astonishment what she could mean when she said something like, "Yes, I know how terribly good-looking I am," or, "Of course every one is in love with me," and so forth. Her mother was a person always busy, since she had a passion for housekeeping, gardening, flowers, canaries, and pretty trinkets. Her rooms and garden, it is true, were small and poorly fitted up, yet everything in them was so neat and methodical, and bore such a general air of that gentle gaiety which one hears expressed in a waltz or polka, that the word "toy," by which guests often express their praise of it all, exactly suited her surroundings. She herself was a toy, being petite, slender, fresh-colored, small, and pretty-handed, and invariably gay and well-dressed. The only fault in her was that a slight over-prominence of the dark blue veins on her little hands rather marred the general effect of her appearance. On the other hand, her daughter scarcely ever did anything at all. Not only has she no love for trifling with flowers and trinkets, but she neglected her personal exterior, and only troubled to dress herself well when guests happened to call. Yet, on returning to the room in society costume, she always looked extremely handsome, save for that cold, uniform expression of eyes and smile, which is common to all beauties. In fact, her strictly regular, beautiful face and symmetrical figure always seemed to be saying to you, "Yes, you may look at me." At the same time, for all the mother's liveliness of disposition and the daughter's air of indifference and abstraction, something told one that the former was incapable of feeling affection for anything that was not pretty and gay, but that Avdotia, on the contrary, was one of those natures which, once they love, are willing to sacrifice their whole life for the man they adore. Chapter 34. My Father's Second Marriage. My father was 48 when he took as his second wife Avdotia Vassilievna Epifanov. I suspect that when that spring he had departed for the country with the girls, he had been in that communicatively happy, sociable mood in which gamblers usually find themselves who have retired from play after winning large stakes. He had felt that he still had a fortune left to him, which, so long as he did not squander it on gaming, might be used for our advancement in life. Moreover, it was springtime. He was unexpectedly well supplied with ready money, he was alone, and he had nothing to do. As he conversed with Jakoff on various matters, and remembered both the interminable suit with the Epifanovs and Avdotia's beauty (it was a long while since he had seen her), I can imagine him saying, "How do you think we ought to act in this suit, Jakoff? My idea is simply to let the cursed land go. Eh? What do you think about it?" I can imagine, too, how, thus interrogated, Jakoff twirled his fingers behind his back in a deprecatory sort of way, and proceeded to argue that, all the same, "Peter Alexandritch, we are in the right." Nevertheless, I further conjecture, Papa ordered the dog-cart to be got ready, put on his fashionable olive-coloured driving-coat, brushed up the remnants of his hair, sprinkled his clothes with scent, and, greatly pleased to think that he was acting à la seigneur, as well as even more revelling in the prospect of soon seeing a pretty woman, drove off to visit his neighbours. I can imagine, too, that when the flustered housemaid ran to inform Peter Vassilievitch that Monsieur Urtenieff himself had called, Peter answered angrily, "Well, what has he come for?" and, stepping softly about the house, first went into his study to put on his old soiled jacket, and then sent down word to the cook that on no account whatever, no, not even if she were ordered to do so by the mistress herself, was she to add anything to luncheon. Since later I often saw Papa with Peter, I can form a very good idea of this first interview between them. I can imagine that, despite Papa's proposal to end the suit in a peaceful manner, Peter was morose and resentful at the thought of having sacrificed his career to his mother, and at Papa having done nothing of the kind. A by no means surprising circumstance, Peter probably said to himself. Next, I can see Papa taking no notice of this ill-humour, but cracking quips and jests, while Peter gradually found himself forced to treat him as a humorist with whom he felt offended one moment and inclined to be reconciled the next. Indeed, with his instinct for making fun of everything, Papa often used to address Peter as Colonel, and though I can remember Peter once replying with an unusually violent stutter, and his face scarlet with indignation, that he had never been a colonel, but only a lieutenant, Papa called him Colonel again before another 5 minutes were out. Lubotshka told me that up to the time of Woloda's and my arrival from Moscow there had been daily meetings with the Epifanovs, and that things had been very lively, since Papa, who had a genius for arranging everything with a touch of originality and wit, as well as in a simple and refined manner, had devised shooting and fishing parties and fireworks for the Epifanovs' benefit. All these festivities, so said Lubotshka, would have gone off splendidly but for the intolerable Peter, who had spoilt everything by his puffing and stuttering. After our coming, however, the Epifanovs only visited us twice, and we went once to their house, while after St. Peter's Day, on which, it being Papa's name-day, the Epifanovs called upon us in common with a crowd of other guests, our relations with that family came entirely to an end, and in future only Papa went to see them. During the brief period when I had opportunities of seeing Papa and Dunetchka, as her mother called Avdotia, together, this is what I remarked about them. Papa remained unceasingly in the same buoyant mood as had so greatly struck me on the day after our arrival. So gay and youthful and full of life and happy did he seem that the beams of his felicity extended themselves to all around him, and involuntarily communicated to them a similar frame of mind. He never stirred from Avdotia's side so long as she was in the room, but either kept on plying her with sugary sweet compliments which made me feel ashamed for him, or, with his gaze fixed upon her with an air at once passionate and complacent, sat hitching his shoulder and coughing as from time to time he smiled and whispered something in her ear. Yet throughout he wore the same expression of raillery as was peculiar to him even in the most serious matters. As a rule, Avdotia herself seemed to catch the infection of the happiness which sparkled at this period in Papa's large blue eyes. Yet there were moments also when she would be seized with such a fit of shyness that I, who knew the feeling well, was full of sympathy and compassion as I regarded her embarrassment. At moments of this kind she seemed to be afraid of every glance and every movement, to be supposing that every one was looking at her, every one thinking of no one but her, and that unfavourably. She would glance timidly from one person to another, the colour coming and going in her cheeks, and then begin to talk loudly and defiantly, but, for the most part, nonsense; until presently, realizing this, and supposing that Papa and every one else had heard her, she would blush more painfully than ever. Yet Papa never noticed her nonsense, for he was too much taken up with coughing and with gazing at her with his look of happy, triumphant devotion. I noticed, too, that, although these fits of shyness attacked Avdotia without any visible cause, they not infrequently ensued upon Papa's mention of one or another young and beautiful woman. Frequent transitions from depression to that strange, awkward gaiety of hers, to which I have referred before the repetition of favourite words and turns of speech of Papa's, the continuation of discussions with others, which Papa had already begun, all these things, if my father had not been the principal actor in the matter, and I had been a little older, would have explained to me the relations subsisting between him and Avdotia. At the time, however, I never surmised them. No, not even when Papa received from her brother Peter a letter which so upset him that not again until the end of August did he go to call upon the Epifanoffs. Then, however, he began his visits once more, and ended by informing us, on the day before Woloda and I were to return to Moscow, that he was about to take Avdotia Vassilievna Epifanov to be his wife. Chapter 35. How we received the news. Yet, even on the eve of the official announcement, every one had learnt of the matter, and was discussing it. Mimi never left her room that day, and wept copiously. Katenka kept her company, and only came out for luncheon, with a grieved expression on her face, which was manifestly borrowed from her mother. Lubotshka, on the contrary, was very cheerful, and told us after luncheon that she knew of a splendid secret which she was going to tell no one. "There is nothing so splendid about your secret," said Woloda, who did not in the least share her satisfaction. "If you were capable of any serious thought at all, you would understand that it is a very bad lookout for us." Lubotshka stared at him in amazement, and said no more. After the meal was over, Woloda made a feint of taking me by the arm, and then, fearing that this would seem too much like affection, nudged me gently by the elbow, and beckoned me towards the salon. "You know, I suppose, what the secret is of which Lubotshka was speaking?" he said when he was sure that we were alone. It was seldom that he and I spoke together in confidence, with the result that, whenever it came about, we felt a kind of awkwardness in one another's presence, and "boys began to jump about in our eyes," as Woloda expressed it. On the present occasion, however, he answered the excitement in my eyes with a grave, fixed look which said, "You need not be surprised, for we are brothers, and we have to consider an important family matter." I understood him, and he went on. "You know, I suppose, that Papa is going to marry Avdotia Epifanov?" I nodded, for I had already heard so. "Well, it is not a good thing," continued Woloda. "Why so?" "Why," he repeated irritably, "because it will be so pleasant, won't it, to have this stuttering Colonel and all his family for relations? Certainly she seems nice enough as yet, but who knows what she will turn out to be later? It won't matter much to you or myself, but Lubotshka will soon be making her debut, and it will hardly be nice for her to have such a belle-mère as this, a woman who speaks French badly, and has no manners to teach her." Although it seemed odd to hear Woloda criticizing Papa's choice so coolly, I felt that he was right. "Why is he marrying her?" I asked. "Oh, it is a hole-and-corner business, and God only knows why," he answered. "All I know is that her brother, Peter, tried to make conditions about the marriage, and that, although at first Papa would not hear of them, he afterwards took some fancy or knight-errantry or other into his head. But, as I say, it is a hole-and-corner business. I am only just beginning to understand my father." The fact that Woloda called Papa my father instead of Papa somehow hurt me. And though I can see that he is kind and clever, he is irresponsible, and frivolous to a degree that—well, the whole thing is astonishing. He cannot so much as look upon a woman calmly. You yourself know how he falls in love with every one that he meets. You know it, and so does Mimi. "What do you mean?" I said. "What I say. Not long ago I learnt that he used to be in love with Mimi herself when he was a young man, and that he used to send her poetry, and that there really was something between them. Mimi is heartsore about it to this day." And Woloda burst out laughing. "Impossible!" I cried in astonishment. "But the principal thing at this moment," went on Woloda, becoming serious again, and relapsing into French, is to think how delighted all our relations will be with this marriage. Why, she will probably have children!" Woloda's prudence and forethought struck me so forcibly that I had no answer to make. Just at this moment Lubotshka approached us. "So you know?" she said with a joyful face. "Yes," said Woloda. "Still, I am surprised at you, Lubotshka. You are no longer a baby in long clothes. Why should you be so pleased because Papa is going to marry a piece of trash?" At this Lubotshka's face fell, and she became serious. "Oh, Woloda!" she exclaimed. "Why a piece of trash, indeed? How can you dare to speak of Avdotia like that? If Papa is going to marry her, she cannot be trash. No, not trash, so to speak, but—" "No buts at all," interrupted Lubotshka, flaring up. "You have never heard me call the girl whom you are in love with trash. How, then, can you speak so of Papa and a respectable woman? Although you are my elder brother, I won't allow you to speak like that. You ought not to." "Mayn't I even express an opinion about—" "No, you mayn't," repeated Lubotshka. "No one ought to criticize such a father as ours. Mimi has the right to, but not you, however much you may be the eldest brother." "Oh, you don't understand anything," said Woloda contemptuously. "Try and do so. How can it be a good thing that a Dunetchka of an Epifanov should take the place of our dead Mamma?" For a moment Lubotshka was silent. Then the tears suddenly came into her eyes. "I knew that you were conceited, but I never thought that you could be cruel," she said, and left us. "Pshaw!" said Woloda, pulling a serio-comic face and make-believe, stupid eyes. "That's what comes of arguing with them." Evidently he felt that he was at fault in having so far forgot himself as to descend to discuss matters at all with Lubotshka. Next day the weather was bad, and neither Papa nor the ladies had come down to morning tea when I entered the drawing-room. There had been cold rain in the night, and remnants of the clouds from which it had descended were still scudding across the sky, with the sun's luminous disk, not yet risen to any great height, showing faintly through them. It was a windy, damp, grey morning. The door into the garden was standing open, and pools left by the night's rain were drying on the damp, blackened flags of the terrace. The open door was swinging on its iron hinges in the wind, and all the paths looked wet and muddy. The old birch-trees with their naked white branches, the bushes, the turf, the nettles, the currant-trees, the elders with the pale side of their leaves turned upwards, all were dashing themselves about and looking as though they were trying to wrench themselves free from their roots. From the avenue of lime-trees showers of round, yellow leaves were flying through the air in tossing, eddying circles, and strewing the wet road and soaked aftermath of the hayfield with a clammy carpet. At the moment, my thoughts were wholly taken up with my father's approaching marriage, and with the point of view from which Woloda regarded it. The future seemed to me to bode no good for any of us. I felt distressed to think that a woman who was not only a stranger, but young, should be going to associate with us in so many relations of life, without having any right to do so. Nay, that this young woman was going to usurp the place of our dead mother. I felt depressed, and kept thinking more and more that my father was to blame in the matter. Presently I heard his voice and Woloda's speaking together in the pantry, and not wishing to meet Papa just then, had just left the room when I was pursued by Lubotshka, who said that Papa wanted to see me. He was standing in the drawing-room with his hand resting on the piano, and was gazing in my direction with an air at once grave and impatient. His face no longer wore the youthful, gay expression which had struck me for so long, but, on the contrary, looked sad. Woloda was walking about the room with a pipe in his hand. I approached my father and bade him good morning. "Well, my children," he said firmly, with a lift of his head, and in the peculiarly hurried manner of one who wishes to announce something obviously unwelcome, but no longer admitting of reconsideration. "You know, I suppose, that I am going to marry Avdotia Epifanov." He paused a moment. "Hitherto I had no desire for any one to succeed your mother, but—" and again he paused. It is evidently my fate. Dunetchka is an excellent, kind girl, and no longer in her first youth. I hope, therefore, my children, that you will like her, and she, I know, will be sincerely fond of you, for she is a good woman. And now," he went on, addressing himself more particularly to Woloda and myself, and having the appearance of speaking hurriedly in order to prevent us from interrupting him, "It is time for you to depart, while I myself am going to stay here until the New Year, and then to follow you to Moscow, with—" again he hesitated a moment, "my wife and Lubotshka." It hurt me to see my father standing as though abashed and at fault before us, so I moved a little nearer him, but Woloda only went on walking about the room with his head down, and smoking. "So, my children, that is what your old father has planned to do," concluded Papa, reddening, coughing, and offering Woloda and myself his hands. Tears were in his eyes as he said this, and I noticed, too, that the hand which he was holding out to Woloda, who at that moment chanced to be at the other end of the room, was shaking slightly. The sight of that shaking hand gave me an unpleasant shock, for I remembered that Papa had served in 1812, and had been, as every one knew, a brave officer. Seizing the great veiny hand, I covered it with kisses, and he squeezed mine hard in return. Then, with a sob amid his tears, he suddenly threw his arms around Lubotshka's dark head, and kissed her again and again on the eyes. Woloda pretended that he had dropped his pipe, and, bending down, wiped his eyes furtively with the back of his hand. Then, endeavouring to escape notice, he left the room. Chapter 36. The University. The wedding was to take place in 2 weeks' time, but as our lectures had begun already, Woloda and myself were forced to return to Moscow at the beginning of September. The Nechludoffs had also returned from the country, and Dimitri, with whom on parting I had made an agreement that we should correspond frequently, with the result, of course, that we had never once written to one another, came to see us immediately after our arrival, and arranged to escort me to my first lecture on the morrow. It was a beautiful sunny day. No sooner had I entered the auditorium than I felt my personality entirely disappear amid the swarm of light-hearted youths who were seething tumultuously through every doorway and corridor under the influence of the sunlight pouring through the great windows. I found the sense of being a member of this huge community very pleasing, yet there were few among the throng whom I knew, and that only on terms of a nod and a "How do you do, Urtenieff?" All around me men were shaking hands and chatting together. From every side came expressions of friendship, laughter, jests, and badinage. Everywhere I could feel the tie which bound this youthful society in one, and everywhere, too, I could feel that it left me out. Yet this impression lasted for a moment only, and was succeeded, together with the vexation which it had caused, by the idea that it was best that I should not belong to that society, but keep to my own circle of gentlemen. Wherefore I proceeded to seat myself upon the third bench, with as neighbours Count B., Baron Z., the Prince R., Iwan, and some other young men of the same class, with none of whom, however, I was acquainted save with Iwan and Count B. Yet the look which these young gentlemen threw at me at once made me feel that I was not of their set, and I turned to observe what was going on around me. Semenoff, with grey matted hair, white teeth, and tunic flying open, was seated a little distance off, and leaning forward on his elbows as he nibbled a pen, while the gymnasium student who had come out first in the examinations had established himself on the front bench, and, with a black stock coming half-way up his cheek, was toying with the silver watch-chain which adorned his satin waistcoat. On a bench in a raised part of the hall I could descry Ikonin. Evidently he had contrived to enter the University somehow, and hear him fussily proclaiming, in all the glory of blue piped trousers which completely hid his boots, that he was now seated on Parnassus. Ilinka, who had surprised me by giving me a bow not only cold but supercilious, as though to remind me that here we were all equals, was just in front of me, with his legs resting in free and easy style on another bench, a hit, somehow, I thought, at myself, and conversing with a student as he threw occasional glances in my direction. Iwan's set by my side were talking in French, yet every word which I overheard of their conversation seemed to me both stupid and incorrect. "Ce n'est pas français," I thought to myself, while all the attitudes, utterances, and doings of Semenoff, Ilinka, and the rest struck me as uniformly coarse, ungentlemanly, and comme il ne faut pas. Thus attached to no particular set, I felt isolated, and unable to make friends, and so grew resentful. One of the students on the bench in front of me kept biting his nails, which were raw to the quick already, and this so disgusted me that I edged away from him. In short, I remember finding my first day a most depressing affair. When the professor entered, and there was a general stir and a cessation of chatter, I remember throwing a scornful glance at him, as also that he began his discourse with a sentence which I thought devoid of meaning. I had expected the lecture to be, from first to last, so clever that not a word ought to be taken from or added to it. Disappointed in this, I at once proceeded to draw beneath the heading "First Lecture," with which I had adorned my beautifully bound notebook, no less than 18 faces in profile, joined together in a sort of chaplet, and only occasionally moved my hand along the page in order to give the professor, who I felt sure must be greatly interested in me, the impression that I was writing something. In fact, at this very first lecture I came to the decision, which I maintained to the end of my course, namely, that it was unnecessary, and even stupid, to take down every word said by every professor. At subsequent lectures, however, I did not feel my isolation so strongly, since I made several acquaintances, and got into the way of shaking hands and entering into conversation. Yet, for some reason or another, no real intimacy ever sprang up between us, and I often found myself depressed and only feigning cheerfulness. With the set which comprised Iwin and the aristocrats, as they were generally known, I could not make any headway at all, for, as I now remember, I was always shy and churlish to them, and nodded to them only when they nodded to me, so that they had little inducement to desire my acquaintance. With most of the other students, however, this arose from quite a different cause. As soon as ever I discerned friendliness on the part of a comrade, I at once gave him to understand that I went to luncheon with Prince Ivan Ivanovitch, and kept my own drozhki. All this I said merely to show myself in the most favourable light in his eyes, and to induce him to like me all the more. Yet almost invariably the only result of my communicating to him the intelligence concerning the drozhki and my relationship to Prince Ivan Ivanovitch was that, to my astonishment, he at once adopted a cold and haughty bearing towards me. Among us we had a Crown student named Operoff, a very modest, industrious, and clever young fellow, who always offered one his hand like a slab of wood, that is to say, without closing his fingers or making the slightest movement with them, with the result that his comrades often did the same to him in jest, and called it the deal-board way of shaking hands. He and I nearly always sat next to one another, and discussed matters generally. In particular, he pleased me with the freedom with which he would criticize the professors, as he pointed out to me with great clearness and acumen the merits or demerits of their respective ways of teaching, and made occasional fun of them. Such remarks I found exceedingly striking and diverting when uttered in his quiet, mincing voice. Nevertheless, he never let a lecture pass without taking careful notes of it in his fine handwriting, and eventually we decided to join forces, and to do our preparation together. Things had progressed to the point of his always looking pleased when I took my usual seat beside him, when, unfortunately, I one day found it necessary to inform him that, before her death, my mother had besought my father never to allow us to enter for a government scholarship, as well as that I myself considered Crown students, no matter how clever, to be— "Well, they are not gentlemen," I concluded, though beginning to flounder a little and grow red. At the moment Operoff said nothing, but at subsequent lectures he ceased to greet me or to offer me his board-like hand, and never attempted to talk to me, but as soon as ever I sat down he would lean his head upon his arm, and purport to be absorbed in his notebooks. I was surprised at this sudden coolness, but looked upon it as infra dig, pour un jeune homme de bonne maison, to curry favour with a mere Crown student of an Operoff, and so left him severely alone, though I confess that his aloofness hurt my feelings. On one occasion I arrived before him, and since the lecture was to be delivered by a popular professor whom students came to hear who did not usually attend such functions, I found almost every seat occupied. Accordingly, I secured Operoff's place for myself by spreading my notebooks on the desk before it, after which I left the room again for a moment. When I returned, I perceived that my paraphernalia had been relegated to the bench behind, and the place taken by Operoff himself. I remarked to him that I had already secured it by placing my notebooks there. "I know nothing about that," he replied sharply, yet without looking up at me. "I tell you I placed my notebooks there," I repeated, purposely trying to bluster, in the hope of intimidating him. "Every one saw me do it," I added, including the students near me in my glance. Several of them looked at me with curiosity, yet none of them spoke. "Seats cannot be booked here," said Operoff. "Whoever first sits down in a place keeps it." And settling himself angrily where he was, he flashed at me a glance of defiance. "Well, that only means you are a cad," I said. I have an idea that he murmured something about my being a stupid young idiot, but I decided not to hear it. What would be the use, I asked myself, of my hearing it? That we should brawl like a couple of manants over less than nothing? I was very fond of the word manants, and often used it for meeting awkward junctures. Perhaps I should have said something more had not at that moment a door slammed and the professor, dressed in a blue frock-coat and shuffling his feet as he walked, ascended the rostrum. Nevertheless, when the examination was about to come on, and I had need of some one's notebooks, Operoff remembered his promise to lend me his, and we did our preparation together. End of Section 9. Recording by Bill Borst.